watch and discuss the horrific, the obscure, and the flat-out strange from the other side of cinema. I'm Mark Dickerson.
And I'm Jeremy Fink. And this is part 3 in our series Cinema Slackers, where we take a psychedelic trip through some of cinema's greatest wanderers and drifters. Kick back, roll one up, and listen in. Today we'll be discussing the 1994 film CLERKS, written and directed and co-produced by Kevin Smith, starring Brian O'Halloran and Jeff Anderson.
Title does not dictate behavior. What? If title dictated my behavior as a clerk serving the public, I wouldn't be allowed to spit water at that guy. But I did. So my point is that people dictate their own behavior. Even though I work in a video store, I choose to go rent movies at Big Choice. Agreed?
You are a danger to both the dead and the living.
I like to think I'm a master of my own destiny.
Please get the hell out of here.
I know I'm your hero.
It follows a day in the life of our main character, Dante, and his best friend, Randall, as they work at, Dante works at a convenience store and Randall works at a video store, and they kind of get into the shenanigans of everyday suburban life, I believe in New Jersey. This was kind of a pretty important film at the time. It was part of the Sundance movement. It got picked up by Miramax, which was a big deal, and Kevin Smith and his friends shot this film for a little bit under $30,000 using the convenience store where Smith worked in real life.
Mm-hmm. And this is another day in the life, much like the film we just talked about, Slacker. Mm-hmm. And Slacker had a big influence on Kevin Smith. He said that it was that movie that made him want to make this movie and to be a director in general. So, as we said last time, rarely do we go from one film so easily into the next, but I think this one's pretty appropriate for the one we just watched.
Yeah, they kind of pair together perfectly.
Very different, obviously.
Very different, but you can really see a through line, which is nice.
Yes.
It's exciting, I think, because, we do different kinds of series on this show, so sometimes there's a clear A to B, but sometimes it'll be totally removed. It'll just be kind of in the same genre or same ideology. But these two films, being Slacker and Clerks, like you mentioned, Mark, literally Clerks got made because Kevin Smith was from New Jersey and he would go to the Angelica Film Center on Houston Street in Manhattan, which if you're ever in Manhattan and get the chance, it's a beautiful, beautiful movie theater. Would highly recommend going there. And they still, to this day, show a lot of art house movies, a lot of foreign films. So Kevin Smith, as a budding cinephile, would find his way there and happen to come across Slacker. And it really influenced the way he thought about filmmaking. And I think just gave him the confidence, which is such a big thing for young filmmakers. It gave him the confidence to just say, hey, that looked very reasonable. I think I could go out and do this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and much like Slacker, it has that notoriety for being... a lot of people look at this as, this is the way people talk, this is the way people interact, and things like that. And again, like I said about Slacker, I feel like when you actually go back and rewatch these movies, maybe it doesn't ring completely true, but just something about the way that these people interact, I mean, it feels genuine. It feels like these people are friends in real life, and it has that vibe of just like hanging out with people. And so, yeah, I mean, both of these movies are similar in that way for sure. And as we said, they are both a day in the life. This one is seen through the eyes of a couple of main characters. The main one is Dante, who works at the convenience store.
Named after Dante's Inferno.
Right, which there are sort of parallels, I guess.
Kind of parallels.
Yeah, I mean, that was also an influence, I guess.
Yeah. To me, it always kind of felt like someone learned about Dante's Inferno, but didn't necessarily read it.
Yeah, it was almost like
decided that they liked the vibe and they liked the idea.
Yeah,
but not in like a stupid way. It was clever. It just I was trying to figure out exactly how. But
yeah, I didn't look too much into that. I think some of the titles are influenced by it.
Yeah, definitely.
Derived from it. So yeah, Dante, he's the main character, and he's sort of an everyman. Because we've all had jobs like that.
Yeah.
We've all had days like that,
there.
I would say. Like where you maybe you weren't supposed to be there, as he says. I wasn't supposed to be there today. So he's the main guy, and his friend Randall, who we actually don't meet until a little bit later on, he works at a video store, which is basically right next to the convenience store. And as I was telling Jeremy, like I always feel like they work at the same store because Randall's always at the convenience store. He's hardly ever at his own store, which is kind of funny. And he could not care less about that store. And actually, one of the funniest parts to me is when he tells Dante, "I'm going to go to the video store." and he's talking about a different one. He's like, "What?" He's like, "You work in a video store. Why don't you just?" He's like, "Yeah, but our store sucks. We don't have any
Yeah.
good, good stuff." So I thought that was pretty funny.
Well, Randall's a great character because he's kind of
Yeah.
he's kind of an absurdist a little bit. You know, he seems to not really have any regard for the conventions of being a normal, decent human being. You know, he kind of he
could
follows
care
his
less.
whims. He has no problem. There's one scene where he spits on a customer just to prove a point. He's kind of he reminds me. I'm a big fan of the artist Marcel Duchamp, who is most famous for putting a toilet in an art gallery back in the early 20th century. And I think that Randall kind of is that kind of character where, you know,
Provocateur.
he's a provocateur. He's not a stupid guy. He's smart. He's definitely a little flighty, to say the least. But he kind of just does things to make his point and illustrate his ideas in a way that sometimes gets it across. Oftentimes it gets missed, but almost all of the time is offensive or destructive in some way.
Well, there's that really famous scene where he's the mother and daughter come into very young daughter come into the video store, and he's just on the phone rattling off names of porno films and just goes on and on. So stuff like he just does stuff like that, and that he's a very entertaining character, and everyone also kind of has a friend like him. I feel like I mean he just has that familiarity to him, and it really makes the movie work. I think just the chemistry between the two of them. And also, as a moment in time, as a photograph of the time, you can't get more early 90s than hanging out at a convenience store and a video store, which, remember those? Yeah, so,
right.
I mean, so those two, the occupations they're in and just the way they interact with each other is just very much like Slacker, just a snapshot of that time.
Yeah. Well, and I think that Clerks might be the quintessential 90s movies.
It has to be, yeah.
People might argue that, but I just can't think because there are other movies that were much more famous, like the Quentin Tarantino movies, some of the Robert Rodriguez stuff, Steven Soderbergh. But I think that ultimately,
but as far as what people were actually doing at that time,
this just embodies it.
Where they were, and
and this is interesting because Kevin Smith is part of what now gets referred to as the Sundance generation of filmmakers, but also was referred to as the video store generation. So it was really the first group of filmmakers. A lot of them didn't go to film school, but they worked at video stores or just spent their entire lives in and out of video stores. Yeah.
Quentin Tarantino is a really famous one for that. Yeah.
Yeah.
He used to work at a video store as well.
And you can really see it in the pop culture references, the discussions that they were having. It felt like the kind of thing, you go and you see Star Wars for the 10 billionth time and you talk about it with your friends and you get to the point where because it's so accessible and it's on video, you don't even have to just talk about the movie anymore. You can start coming up with these wacky fan theories as people do now, which I don't know is something that would have necessarily been happening before video stores because people would only see it in a movie theater. There wasn't an online community. You could talk about it with your friends, but you weren't rewatching it necessarily as many times. You would go and see a movie, you would enjoy it, and then you'd be able to think about it, but depending on who saw it, there wasn't this guarantee that anyone could just go pick it up at any time.
Right. Conversations you would have online now, you would have back then just hanging around at a movie store, a convenience store, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
which is definitely a nostalgic thing. I mean, it's weird because for me, the 90s, like I was a little kid in the 90s, so a lot of my childhood memories are going and getting videotapes at the store, but then I kind of am sad I didn't get to experience video stores as a young adult because it looked really interesting. It was just a little bit before my time, but I think it's nostalgic for a lot of people, and I think that's one of the reasons maybe that Clerks has kind of kept itself in the cultural zeitgeist for so long. It's a great movie. It's a lot of fun. I'm not saying that it shouldn't, but I'm saying that a big part of it is it just so embodies a certain moment that very shortly after that moment kind of died.
Yeah, and Kevin Smith was very much in. When you think of Kevin Smith, you do think of the early '90s because you had this movie and you had the next film that he made, Mallrats, which is another obviously like a mainstay, like a haven for the youth in the '90s hanging out at the mall. So that was his next movie after this. So going back to Clerks, I guess you want to do a little rundown of Again, not much plot here, but do you want to just kind of discuss it? I guess what goes on a little bit.
Yeah, so our main character Dante is in a situation where A, he's working at this convenience store, but B, he has two girlfriends, kind of two girlfriends. One
Mm-hmm.
is named Veronica, who seems to really care about him. She's encouraging him to go to school and do something with his life. The other is actually an ex-girlfriend named Caitlin, who he's still kind of obsessed with and trying to find a way to get back together with her, but he finds out partway through the movie that she is engaged to, as they joke, an Asian design major who
Yeah.
kind of gets referenced throughout the film, but we never actually get to see. So
Yeah.
that's kind of his big conflict, is who will he end up with, but it's also what is he doing with his life? Can he put his foot down? As Mark mentioned, he wasn't even supposed to be working that day. There's this really great opening shot of the film, which kind of plays, there's this trope in a lot of I found lower budget movies where it'll open with the main character waking up, and a lot of the time it's kind of the most dull played out way that you can start a movie. You know, a
Yeah.
lot of good writers
You
will
see
talk
that a
about,
lot.
yeah,
Yeah.
like start your movie when things are already happening and starting
Mm-hmm.
with a character waking up. Not to put anyone down, if you can do it in an interesting way, do it.
But I will say, like 90% at least of the films from when I was in film school started out that way.
With someone waking up,
It
yeah.
was like a big pet peeve of mine, yeah.
Yeah, so,
But it works out. It works.
It works
I think,
here. And
yeah.
what's beautiful here is that it's him waking up, but it's him waking up in a very peculiar situation where he's falling out of a closet. You're not exactly sure why he's sleeping there. You don't really get
That's
this.
a great. Yeah,
Yeah.
great. It's actually kind of like Up in Smoke a little bit, where you don't even
Yeah,
know where
you don't
are,
know
what's
where he
going
is.
on.
Yeah, and that's actually a great parallel because we have the shot in
Mhm.
Up in Smoke with the couch.
And the
But
kids, yeah.
yeah, and what I love about this shot though is, and actually kind of the timing works out nicely because as we mentioned, there is the Dante's Inferno kind of referencing throughout, and the opening line of Dante's Inferno, I'm not going to get it verbatim, but it's something like, I found myself off the good path and lost in a wood, and in my mind that opening shot is just the epitome of someone who finds themselves just off of the good path, lost.
Yeah.
So kind of right there you get it, and then it's his journey throughout this day.
Yeah.
And he's kind of just trying to, have a good time, get out of work, find the good things in life. And it's so clear that he's miserable in this job, but at the same time, people keep telling him options and ways he can improve his situation, but he seems to really resist. And that's his struggle. And to me, I think that, so because there's this kind of thing that Mark and I were talking about with Kevin Smith, and Kevin Smith fills a pretty interesting place in contemporary cinema because he kind of blew up really, really fast with this movie. Then he did Mallrats. What is Chasing Amy? He did
Mhm.
Clerks 2. Like
Dogma.
Dogma.
Yeah.
He had a pretty good run of movies. But then there seemed to be this thing somewhere in the late 2000s, maybe even early 2010s, where people started to really kind of reject Kevin Smith.
Yeah.
Um,
He almost
and
became like a dirty word.
yeah,
Among film
he
people.
became like a kind of pariah.
But I think even he himself kind of got lost in,
Yeah.
because once he made, once he got to Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back, it was almost like he didn't really know
Like,
what
where's
else
this
to
going?
do.
Yeah.
It's like what I've created this universe almost, the View Askew-averse, as it's called, because that's his production company, View Askew, and he has. So characters from Clerks will show up in other movies and Mallrats and things like that. So he kind of has his own little world that he's created, which is really cool. But you do get to a certain point where it's like, okay, now what else can I do?
Yeah.
And I think what you're referring to is like he got to that point and people weren't responding as well to his movies at that point.
Yeah,
Right?
and in
Yeah.
my opinion, one of the reasons, because it seems like people rejected some of the other movies, but Clerks is always the one that held up.
Yeah.
And the reason, in my opinion, is in rewatching this movie and having seen some of his other movies, I think that the main focus, the main thing that he was working through in this is character to character relationships. And I think the comedy actually came in, it was secondary to
Comes
these
from the
relationships.
characters, yeah.
Originally, so Kevin Smith was a huge David Lynch fan. This is just a fun fact I learned. And there's the one part actually where Jay in this movie, as in Jay and Silent Bob, who are the drug dealers who hang out by the wall, Jay has this one line where he says, "I'll fuck anything that moves." Which is directly from the movie Blue Velvet. So you kind of get that Kevin, and so originally I heard an interview with Kevin Smith where he said that Clerks was supposed to be this kind of dark movie where it was like a mystery where there's this guy working in a convenience store and it's all the strange, surreal, dreamlike figures who he meets, but then he started writing and very quickly realized that you know, the way he was creating it, it was a lot more geared towards a comedic setting, and he kind of leaned into that. But I think that idea of starting with someone really working through some real problems is what gives this movie such heart
Yeah.
and lets it hold up, because there are a lot of really funny jokes in this movie. Like, there are some laugh out loud, hysterical moments, but ultimately, I think for me, the reason I come back to it is because I love the characters, and as, you know, a young person, I can understand what people in their 20s are going through when they're unsure and wandering. And I think maybe in some of the later Kevin Smith movies where
He
things got
lost that
lost is it became more
genuineness.
about the joke. It became more about just trying to make something really funny, and not
Yeah.
about these like the character storylines and the character struggles would become second and only be used as a conduit to tell jokes, whereas in this movie the jokes are a way of getting to something more interesting.
Yeah, I think you nailed it when you said that this movie has a heart to it that I think I would say that his other films really don't. I mean, there is, you know, like Chasing Amy is a has some of that, and some of the other films do. But I think this film, maybe just because of how young he was and how much he wanted to be a filmmaker and how genuine all of it was, something about it just really works. And I think you can go back to this movie and enjoy it. Um, so just to go into, because I think the behind the scenes for this one's very interesting because of how low budget it is, and what went into making it. So just to go into that a little bit. So Kevin Smith, as we said, he worked at the store where they shot the film, the convenience store, and they shot for 21 straight nights. And this kind of blew me away. This schedule. This just shows you, you know, when you're young, you can do anything. You know what I mean? If you have that drive and that motivation. So they would they would they started at 6 a.m. I'm sorry. He would start his shift at 6 a.m. At the convenience store, Kevin Smith, and then he would finish at 11 p.m., which is already crazy. That's a lot,
Yeah.
very long time to be working. Then they would shoot. So after they closed the store, they would shoot until 4 a.m. And after which he would grab a couple hours of sleep before he would get ready to go back to the store and do it all again. So that is pretty crazy. To do that for 21 straight nights is pretty insane. I don't know. I'm sure they had a break in there somewhere, but still.
Hardly though.
Just
A
yeah,
break,
just
a break. You not a break of days though. A break of hours. It's not
yeah.
like a.
And so I guess what happened was, you know, he worked at the store and he probably just approached the owners or the managers and said, "Hey, can I use this to shoot?" And they were probably like, "Yeah, as long as it's not not when the store is open," which, you know, convenience stores open very long hours. So, and this is actually very interesting because it actually lends itself to the plot of the film, because as they're only allowed to shoot when the store was closed, they couldn't use the actual exterior of the building with the, you know, with the open windows and the doors and everything. The shutters always had to be closed. So he actually made that a part of the story, where they go and where when he shows up to work, he the shutters are stuck and he can't get them open, and it's kind of like an ongoing gag through the whole movie that these shutters are down. So I thought that was a very creative way to deal with that, and so that's just one example of how he used his, you know, what was going on in his life at that time to make this movie. And when I said, like, you know, when you're young and you're motivated, you want to be a filmmaker, you can do stuff like that. You can go on no sleep at all and just, you know, try to make something. And I think that's what he was trying to do here. So it was shot for a total of around $27,000, which is, you know, it's
Not a lot of money.
not a lot of money,
Especially
not
back
much.
then, if you're shooting on
Yeah.
film, probably half
And
of that went to just
you gotta factor
developing
that
and
into it as well.
cutting.
Yeah, right. So upon its release, it did receive pretty good reviews, and it grossed over 3 million in theaters actually, and it really did kind of launch Smith's career from there. And also a big factor of you know, when people think of this film, they think of, okay, it's a black and white film, and you wonder if he did this for artistic choice or whatever, and maybe he did, but the budget was definitely a big part of that. They shot in black and white because they didn't want to have to worry about with lighting, you know, making sure everything looked perfect and the color temperatures and things like that. So they just decided to shoot it very simple black and white, which really works for it because it has that timeless feel to it, even though it is set in the 90s. It is so like universal with the relationships and things like that. So I think it actually really works with the black and white. What do you think about that though?
Yeah, I think it's just so of its moment. You know, it's like the fact that it's in black and white just makes so much sense because it is
It's almost like it really is like a snapshot.
Yeah,
of the
like
time,
I can't even imagine this movie in color. To be frank, it's just so tied to it, and it might have been a budgetary thing, it might have been a creative decision, but either way, I think it's just
It
so.
works. It
Yeah,
works for it.
because it feels like I remember. I mean, my dad is a photographer. I think I've mentioned that before on the show, and I remember what his photographs would look like. From the early '90s, based on the film stocks that were around, and this movie just feels like that. These black and white little snapshots, either inside the store using that really kind of artificial weird lighting, or outside using just natural light with probably no diffusion, no anything. It just really has that. And the funny thing is, now I think Kevin Smith has something to do with this. I think that Sofia Coppola had a lot to do with it. Now people will spend a lot of money to try to give things that snapshot feel, because it's hard now with digital. Digital just eats up light and dark and makes it contrasty and crazy, and it's like hard to get the look that Kevin Smith got. So it's kind of almost funny that these low budget, like the Virgin. I mean, not the Virgin Suicides was so low budget, but like Clerks, Virgin Suicides, these movies that had these very kind of hip, flowy, photographs, people now are trying to spend a lot of money to get in much bigger budget movies, and it's difficult. But these young artists, just because of the technologies they were using at the time combined with their personal aesthetics and interests, were able to get this beautiful, beautiful stuff shot cheaply.
Yeah. But it does add to the overall film, I would say. So it kind of worked out for him.
Yeah.
So sometimes those budget things do work out. That's one of the things I want to talk about. I feel like this film and its budget are just like almost one thing to me. It's the budget is such a big part of the overall film and how it turned out. It kind of makes it what it is, So I think his being resourceful actually added to the film in a lot of different ways. Down to, hey, I'm going to use where I work as the main location.
Yeah.
That's genius in a way, because it hadn't really been done at that point.
It's mariachi filmmaking, as Robert Rodriguez would call it.
Yeah, exactly.
What's interesting too is there's one scene which is one of my favorite plot lines where there's a former classmate of theirs who has passed away because I think it's a brain aneurysm, and there's a scene where you see them walking into a funeral home to go to the wake, and then it cuts and says 5 minutes later, and then they come running out and something has gone horribly wrong. And what's interesting is that's actually considered a lost scene, not because they shot it at the time and lost it, but because it was written into the script, but it was too expensive to shoot. And they actually went back in, because there was Clerks, the animated series, years later, and they actually animated this lost scene. I don't know if you've seen this, Mark.
I've heard about it.
Yeah, I actually just watched it this morning before we were talking about this, and it's a pretty good scene. Like, it's actually a very funny, well-written scene. There's a whole thing about someone, Randall, dropping his car keys into the coffin. It's a whole thing. But I kind of loved, because of that budgetary limitation, that they couldn't do this scene. And it was just, I always wondered. And that mystery I thought was really beautiful. But at the same time, one thing I want to talk about, so I listened to this other podcast, and I'll have to pull that up at the end. Maybe we can link to it somewhere. But it's all about film noir movie. And they were talking about this movie Detour, which is actually what Richard Linklater's production company is called Detour Film. So Detour is directed by this guy named Edward Gialmer. It's from 1945, and it was considered like a micro-budget noir. It was done, back then there were the studios, and it was done with what was considered a poverty row studio. And one thing that they were saying on this podcast is that they thought it was almost detrimental to discuss that film as micro-budget because they felt it didn't give it enough credit for being what it was. Which is something that is an interesting idea, because with film we so often talk about the money. We talk about what it was made for, how that ties in. But what's interesting is, you wouldn't talk about how much money a writer spent on paper and ink. You wouldn't talk about how much money a painter spent on paint. It would just be about what the final product is, kind of regardless of that. So what I'd like to talk about with Clerks is how good the writing is. And that's kind of something that's separate from budget or anything else, because this movie is just really beautifully constructed. The way that it's hard for people who have written anything that's long form, know how difficult it is. People who haven't but plan to try, it's a lot of work. So go in with a good attitude, but be prepared to fight, because it's a struggle. But filling up an hour and a half of screen time or a novel connecting things is really difficult. You can have a lot of great scenes, a lot of great chapters, and they can be beautiful in their own right, but finding ways to tie them all together is really difficult. And then to actually have something more meaningful in a way that your main character or characters can grow in some way or learn something that isn't too on the nose and obvious, but isn't too abstracted. It's really, really difficult. And I thought that the way that this script was written, like every little thing that popped up somehow became tied together, with maybe the exception of the Star Wars scene where they're talking about, you know, all the contractors who would have died on the Death Star as it was being built. But that actually, interestingly enough, fun fact, is the original ending to Clerks was that someone would come in and shoot Dante.
I wanted to talk about that.
There was, and so that would have actually been how it tied in, because in the story about the people on the Death Star, this other guy comes in and says that he's had a similar experience with his friend, and his friend ended up dying because of a mob hit. So originally, even that was supposed to tie together. And there's so many little beats in this film, from the guy falling asleep in the bathroom to the ongoing joke about shoe polish. Like, there's so many things that run all the way through in a really beautiful, intricate, delicate way that's so hard to do.
For a movie that's considered to have almost no plot at all, you're right. I think there is a lot of little details and a lot of things that tie into each other as you watch it. So it's not just like vignettes, like it actually all kind of works together in a way. And since you brought it up, I do want to talk about that alternate ending, because I think it's very interesting. It's kind of one of those notorious alternate endings, much like the one for Little Shop of Horrors, which I do want to talk about when we get to that movie, because that's a huge one. Yeah. But this one, so the original ending that Kevin Smith had, and even up until they were doing test screenings, was that Dante gets shot by someone comes in and robs the store and shoots him and takes cigarettes, which actually does tie into a scene that happened earlier with cigarettes. And while it's very dark and almost doesn't make sense for a film like this, I can see where he was going with it. And it's one of those things that when you're writing a movie, like you said, I mean, it's a long process to write something. And I think when he was writing it, it probably made a lot of sense to end it that way. And he since said that the reason that it ended that way is because he didn't know how to end movies back then.
Well, I'm not sure. A lot of people know. It's hard to end a movie.
It is hard to end movies, but because it was his first movie, it's like, I just didn't know how to end it. But I think he's kind of downplaying it a little bit. I think it actually makes more sense than, you know what I mean? Like it makes, it's almost like a very ironic ending. It's just very, because I don't know. To me, it just makes a certain sort of sense, and because it kind of emphasizes the randomness of life, and he wasn't even supposed to be there that day and stuff like that. But considering the movie is a comedy, and I think it was probably a good move to get rid of it. But I think it's very interesting to look at it. It's also interesting that Miramax was actually behind him for that, because they are notorious for kind of making lots of cuts to
Harvey
movies.
Scissorhands.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, now he's probably noticed something else.
No, it's something else now, but something else with hands. But back then it was Harvey Scissorhands.
Back then it was, So they were pretty notorious for that, and the fact that they were okay with him leaving it in, leaving it up to him. I'm sure they actually wanted it out, but he kind of last minute. I don't know if someone convinced him or what happened, but he kind of just decided to take it out. And, it makes a big impact on the rest. Because now you look at the film and it's very lighthearted and you don't really think about that. So I thought that was interesting. I think you can still see it on the DVD, though. The Blu-ray, they have that on there. Yeah.
Well, and I think it's an interesting ending, because that kind of would bring it into that really Lynchian realm that...
almost more surreal,
Yeah, because, I mean, it is kind of a really postmodern ending. Which is, I think that the sentimentality of this is maybe why it's held up, because we've seen this kind of paradigm shift in popular culture from this very Seinfeld, postmodern, cold, which, I mean, I love Seinfeld, but, there was this kind in the 90s, there was this very kind of cold, ironic sensibility that in the 2000s, in like a post 9/11 world, people said, it's kind of nice when people don't hate each other and things actually are kind of but I do think that it is a really interesting postmodern, the idea that this character could go through everything, have his kind of aha moment, and see what he needs to do to grow as a person, and then get shot. I think is a kind of fantastic awful ending. Awful not in that it's a bad decision, awful in that it would just be so depressing. But really interesting.
Down ending.
Kind of the anti Hollywood, anti movie, which is maybe why I could imagine executives getting behind that ending is that what they're selling, the product they're selling here is the anti-Hollywood movie. And what's more of an anti-Hollywood ending than everyone learned? That would be like at the end of It's a Wonderful Life. If a samurai came in and hacked Jimmy Stewart to pieces, it would be like, there'd be no point to all of that.
Well, something to get people talking for sure.
Yeah.
I think maybe that's what they were thinking, because they knew they had something on their hands. They had to know that.
Yeah.
So they were probably like, oh, this will get people, talking about it anymore.
It'll stir the pot.
Yeah. So, but the way it ends now is it almost kind of just abruptly ends, and I kind of like that because I think it actually probably even works better than the other ending, because it's almost like. It's just like, because that's, sometimes days end like that, where it's just like, now it's over.
It's over. Yeah.
This is what happened, and now now we're on to the next day.
And one thing that was strange to me, and have you ever heard of the Mandala Effect, Mark?
Yes, I have.
Yeah.
I think we actually might have talked about.
We might have talked about it before, but and I'm not going to get into the entomology of it, but the Mandala Effect is basically when we remember certain things differently than they actually happened. Yeah. So, for example. What's a good example? Like the Bernstein Bears.
Yes,
were actually
bring that up.
They were. I believe the name was the Berenstein Bears, right? That's what it is.
It was the Barons. No, wait, hold on. Let me.
It's the Baron.
I have to think about it because
the Bernstein Bears. The actual name is the Berenstain Bears. That's spelled BERENSTAIN.
Actual name.
But everyone remembers it. It's the Bernstein Bears. And so this movie, I think, kind of Mandela affected me because there were things that in my mind I remembered them
definitely
playing a certain way. Like, for example, the relationship situation, with the two women is kind of never really resolved.
No.
Like he has this argument where Veronica is like kicking him while he's on the ground, telling him what a shit he is, and then she just leaves. And then he sees Randall again, and the movie's over. And in my mind, it was always like this happy ending where they resolved it, and it's not. She just leaves.
Not at all.
She just leaves, which is and to me, and that's so interesting because
it is.
So I'm listening to these lectures by David Mamet online right now, and one thing he's talking about is how in tragedy, a sad ending befalls our hero because he's chasing after something. He gave the example of Wile E. Coyote. It's like he's always chasing after something, but at the end of the day, it's always going to end poorly. Whereas drama is you look into something and you see how life goes for a little bit. And I think that even though this is a comedy, I think it could also be considered a drama because that's basically what it is. We're looking in on this character's life. He kind of maybe gets a little better in terms of working on himself, but he's going to go back the next day.
He's still going to hate his job.
He's still going to hate his job. He might be starting to think about it, and maybe 3 months down the line he quits his job. But he's not going to quit his job the next day. He might not even quit his job that year. And I haven't seen it all the way through, honestly. But I believe Clerks 2 opens up with them working at the exact same convenience store like years later.
I would have to rewatch it.
Yeah,
but yeah, I think it does.
and I think there is a certain truth, which is interesting too. I think about it all the time with particularly young filmmakers. Because they're making movies, and when you have an ending like that where it's kind of like, maybe it's not going to get better, but at the same time, the person who's writing this is working so hard to do what he wants with his life is kind of an interesting, because maybe, I've heard before that we write our fears, so maybe his fear, Kevin Smith's fear being, not Dante's, well, also Dante's, is that, he's going to just be caught in this endless cycle for the rest of his life, and, things might get a little better. He might kind of realize that he needs to change, but he won't be able to, but he might be able to just find joy, which is beautiful on the one hand, because it does seem by the end of the day, Dante does kind of find a little bit of joy in his situation, but on the other hand, it's like, well, when's he going to take control? Take the next step.
Well, that last conversation that Randall and Dante have is actually really good. I think it actually sums up the film in a way when they're basically the last scene of the movie where it's just they're kind of sitting there talking, and Randall's kind of giving the speech almost where he says, in effect, he says he says verbatim, if we're so advanced, what are we doing here? And I think that kind of like, you know what I mean? Because there's a certain type of person that, they're in these jobs, but they're always like in their head, they're like, I'm better than this. What am I doing here? These people are below me. They kind of look down on the customers and all that.
Or they're impatient.
And they're impatient. They're, but like, what are they waiting for? I mean, if they're not going to make a change now, when are they going to do it?
Yeah.
It can only come from themselves. So it's almost like Randall is kind of wise in that way that he can look outside himself and see that. and it's a very interesting way to end it, because all the conversations you have in the film, it never gets as deep as that last one. I think it's pretty fitting that it is like the last scene in the movie.
Yeah.
So in a way, it does have its own ending.
Yeah.
And like you said, it's more of a slice of life.
It's a slice of life. Yeah.
It's a comedy, but it's also that. So
and I think that's one of the things that why it holds up so well is in a lot of popular comedy, they feel the need to tell the whole story. They feel the need to resolve it and have the hugs and kisses at the end. Yeah. And this one, it's like life goes on, but because of that, the jokes almost seem funnier, because it's like, oh, these funny people are just going to keep being funny. They'll never stop. It's like not that, they don't fall in love and then just go live happily ever after. The next day is going to be shitty, but it's also going to be funny. It's going to be entertaining. And like, you start playing out their scenarios in your own mind past that. I think that it is, to get back to like the real ideas at the core of this, because I do think that surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, but for the genre, surprisingly, this is a movie with a lot going on in terms of the emotional platform, and I think that it's something that, especially with young people, is Randall, the character, is 22 years old in this movie, which I think is one of the beautiful things about the slacker genre, that we've now kind of seen a little bit more. It's kind of been popularized in culture, particularly with shows like Girls, Broad City, things like that explore the experience of people freshly out of college or freshly into the working world. And it's kind of this fear that you had your chance to set yourself up in a way that would bring your life in the right direction, but maybe things haven't gone exactly how you wanted them to, and now what? And I think that this movie, rather than having people just sitting around dwelling on the now what, it kind of uses the show don't tell idea really well, where through their actions, through the frustrations, through the blowing off work, you can see the fear of the now what. And I think it also is a film that has a lot of respect for its characters, because there aren't really stupid people in this movie. There's some dated jokes where maybe it would come across now as someone who's a little bit lewd or uneducated, but there's also a lot of pretty frank, interesting discussion going on.
It's really interesting that you say show don't tell in a movie that's so filled with dialogue.
It's filled with dialogue.
I think you're right, though. Yeah. I think you're right.
It's not on the nose.
It's not, and it's not talking always about the plot or story or anything like that. Sometimes it's just character stuff, which is kind of cool.
Well, and that's something I think, at least in my philosophy of filmmaking, often gets misconstrued. Because I love dialogue. I think dialogue is one of the coolest things. And
it can be used very well, yeah.
Yeah, and I think that this idea of show don't tell often gets misconstrued, meaning don't have people talk about things, find a visual to do it, which of course is amazing when you can do that. But I think it also means, you think about like the opening scene to Reservoir Dogs, and that's 8 minutes of people talking, but you're not really getting any important. You don't know who these people are. You don't know what their problems are. They're just kind of shooting the shit. But
it's
because
more about
of that.
Just not being too on the nose.
Yeah, but because of that, you're getting all these beautiful, rich character details, and that is showing. And I think it's not telling, because telling would be how so many movies open it up. You open it, and they're planning their heist. And I think for this, it would be, you open the movie up, and they're sitting around at the counter, and Dante is saying, "Oh my God, I don't know where my life is going to go." But instead, the first 20 minutes of the movie is mostly talking about blowjobs, and it's it's like and to me that is showing, because it's showing, their attitudes on, they're so in their moment that they're not even realizing these bigger problems that they're trying to hash out.
Well, Silent Bob certainly doesn't tell. So he's
until the end. Until the end.
Yeah.
But then it's so surprising. And Silent Bob is a great character.
Yeah, and that's perfect, because it is the director, obviously, but it's just such a perfect, almost cameo, but also character kind of role, which he went on to show up in his other movies, and I think he starts to talk a little bit more, but in this movie he's just like perfect, just that guy who's just there, so, and let's talk about those characters just for like a moment here. Jay and Silent Bob talk about quintessential 90s slackers. You can't get more, just hanging out outside a convenience store, just like bullshitting, hitting on girls. It's
selling
just like
drugs.
Selling drugs. Yeah, it's like, you can't get more of the time. It's just like perfect, I think.
Yeah, no, they're just such fun, goofy
they're not really
character.
relevant to anything going on, but again, it's like you said, it's just like getting that vibe, the vibe of the characters and the world and what's going on. You just, they're important in that way.
Well, and I do think they are relevant though, because at the end they provide the perfect foil to Dante. It's like there are two people who are just doing their thing.
They are. Yeah, they're content in their lot.
Yeah, like Randall and those two, they're people who traditionally we would look at and say, like, those people must be unhappy because they have nothing going on with their lives. But ultimately, they're kind of the happiest people in the whole film. Like, they play their music, they steal their candy, and, like, that's just life for them. And they're cool with it. And, like, Dante is so upset with his situation. And
I would actually argue that Dante is not a slacker and probably not.
No.
Like in the film, he's definitely one of the people who is not like that at all, or tries to not be like that. But maybe in the end he is. I mean, it kind of comes down to what your definition of a slacker is, which maybe we'll hint on towards the end. But yeah, I mean, he wants to do something, he just doesn't know what it is. He wants to be somewhere where he's not.
Well, and I think that's why this movie pairs nicely with Slacker, and maybe not as closely with Up in Smoke. Is that I think that in Slacker and in this movie, you see people who are trying to do things with their lives.
They did start a punk band and Up in Smoke.
That's true. They did start a punk band. They did start a punk
they had
band.
some dreams,
but you're not exactly sure why they started. like what the intention.
For the hell of it.
Yeah, it's kind of just. I feel like the characters in Up in Smoke are kind of more like Jay and Silent Bob, and that they're just trying to keep themselves happy. They're not really stressing the fact that things aren't going anywhere. They're just going to move in with the wind. But in Slacker and in Clerks, you see people who are really questioning their status as slackers. Like, they really feel that they have something to offer the world, and they're not I don't think that Dante is a lazy character either. I think that he's just someone who has ideas and wants to do things with himself, but just hasn't figured out his avenue yet. He maybe doesn't know exactly what he wants to do. He doesn't really know who he wants to be with. He kind of rejects the good influences in his life, because I think that Dante maybe is someone who wants to figure it out for himself and kind of pushes people away who would help him figure it out. But ultimately, all he really needs is a good influence and a little encouragement. And he's a complicated dude, which is so interesting that he finds himself in the middle of this kind of absurdist comedy with sound effects and, very strange jokes about necrophilia. It's
he's
weird.
Pretty much the straight man in the middle of all this craziness going on.
Yeah.
In a way. So that, I mean, I think that's pretty much wraps it up with Clerks. Is there anything else you wanted to say about it before we...
I mean, like we mentioned, this film, is a 90s classic. We, at some point, I'm sure we'll do another 90s film so we can really kind of talk about the cinematic landscape. I know we're running out of time here a little bit. But definitely, like we mentioned, is the quintessential.
Well, actually, for the next movie, Big Lebowski, I really want to focus on the 90s, because I think that movie does it in a certain way. Looking back on it, but also being in the 90s still. So I think it's kind of interesting.
True.
But this movie, Clerks, definitely had a big impact for many of the indie films that were released after this in the 90s. And I just want to reiterate again that it's this movie and its budget are kind of one thing to me. And the budget is really just impacts what the film is. And I think Kevin Smith was very good with being resourceful and using what he had to his advantage. And it's a scrappy little movie, and that's what I like about it. I think when I went back to it, just those aspects of it is really what appealed to me the most. But yeah, so we'll go into the 90s a little bit more with our next film, and then we'll finally get out of the 90s after that. But the 90s, the 90s and the term slacker, I think, are kind of, they go together. So it makes sense. So that's going to do it for today.
Join us next time as we take a magic carpet ride to Los Angeles and look at the Coen brothers' take on the slacker as well as the film noir with 1998's The Big Lebowski. Dude.
The dude abides. Okay. So that's it. Thanks for listening to Cult Movie Cult. You can find us on iTunes, Podbean, and Spotify, and on social media, which we are on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. If you have any cult films you'd like to hear us discuss on the show, please feel free to reach out to us at cultmoviecult@gmail.com. This has been Cult Movie Cult, and until next time, so long from the other side.